So our first speaker is Darren Bilsborough, who is the director of Hames Charlie and the Adelaide studio leader. Darren is highly regarded for his understanding of the economics of sustainability and also creating a competitive advantage in the development of cities, precincts, and also commercial buildings. Darren has been involved in the sustainable design realm for quite a long time and brings a wealth of experience and knowledge. So we're very honored to have him here today to be able to talk about an idea of biophilic city and biophilic designs. And if you haven't heard about that before, I hope it sort of rocks your world a bit. All right, Darren, we'll let you take it away.
Thanks, Ken. I come from the Al Gore School of Presentations. His An Inconvenient Truth slideshow presentation has around about 360 slides. And given that I've got 20 minutes, I'd better get onto it now, hadn't I? Biophilic design, biophilia, and what does it mean? So there's a little bit of a acknowledgement or definition up there talking about the ability, the love of living that humans have and our innate connection with nature and affinity with nature. We have a deep physiological need to actually connect with nature, and it means that there is a whole lot of benefits, therefore, that derive from our ability to do that. So that's the idea of biophilic design. Ken mentioned my involvement or desire or interest in the economics of sustainability. Some years ago I started that process in writing this paper. I also took this from Al Gore, that a lot of this presentation has to be about me. So this was one of the first efforts that I made in trying to connect economics with biophilic cities, which gets to the absolute root issue that I wanted to talk about, and that is that nothing in the sustainability agenda is worth talking about, in my view, unless you have the ability to talk to money. Where an enormous number of sustainability professionals fail is they don't understand that developers don't build green buildings because they want to save the environment. They're really not interested. What they're interested in is whether or not they can get a return on the investment of those developments. And that runs all the way through every single issue that you want to talk about in relation to sustainability. You must, at the end of the day, determine a return on investment. So it's all about the money. I tried once again about me, to talk about what a biophilic city might mean in a national sense. And this was in response to some conversations around the national budget a few years ago. And I figured that if we thought about the concepts of biophilia and what it meant for our cities, for our buildings, for our people, we might actually solve some of the budget issues that were being talked about in relation to deficits and all of those sorts of nonsense. So what does that mean? Well, first of all, this comes from the 2010 Intergenerational Report. It hasn't actually changed at all. We have an unfunded future health liability in this country, as many countries around the world actually do. And there is no plan at this point in time to actually cover those liabilities. So what might we be able to achieve, and what might we be able to do to ensure that those health liabilities are minimised? Well, biophilia provides some of those opportunities. There's quite a lot of research. There are some of these principles were used on the new RAH hospital, which we're still waiting, obviously, to see how that gets used. But these elements are relatively well known. They're not always implemented, but there is a lot of research that demonstrates the health benefits associated with, in this particular instance, patients being able to see nature, be able to walk through nature. There's a whole host of opportunities that are available. Another piece of research that was done elsewhere in the world is this one, in talking about the therapy of walking in nature through the British Mental Health Charity. And you can see that there's a whole lot of, on the right-hand side, there's a whole lot of reductions in issues like depression, anger, tension, confusion, fatigue, and increased vigour just by being able to walk through nature. So that's just one example of how that actually operates. Another one, does nature help us to be better human beings? This particular study talked about our ability to become more generous. when we have those sorts of connections with nature. There's also some thinking in relation to creativity. So if I go back to my premise about economics and economic activity, and particularly that aligns itself with the idea of creative cities, the whole aspect of thinking about biophilic design, making those connections, connects with the sorts of issues that Richard Florida has been speaking about in the past, in creating more creative cities, more creative communities, and therefore delivering or deriving an economic benefit as associated with that. So the importance in this is about how we might be able to connect with nature in our daily activities. Obviously the biggest opportunity is doing that outside, but that doesn't mean that we can't do that indoors or within precincts. There are plenty of opportunities to do that. And of course it's not just humans that require nature. There is many other species that really have some difficulties sometimes when they don't have sufficient amounts of nature to deal with. I guess the first issue when I start talking about a biophilic city concept, and I'm going to go through about 7 or 8 principles here. The first one is the idea of biodiversity and stabilising ecological systems. I mean, I think there's still a lot of work that's required from a research perspective to make those connections between economic development or economic opportunities, but economic negatives associated with the fact that we're reducing biodiversity within our cities. What does that mean? We're sort of making some sort of connections in relation to health, but there's an awful lot of research that's still required, I think, in determining what the real downsides are for reducing biodiversity that's occurring throughout our cities. So thinking about a biophilic city means that we need to think about biodiversity. Just putting green lawn and trees and things in doesn't actually do that. But if we're thinking of it more holistically, we can certainly get to those outcomes. Just to show you a few examples as well about, this is a green wall that was in Paris. At one point in time, that particular green wall was getting almost as many tourists running past it or looking at it or taking photographs of it as they were the Eiffel Tower, which you can see from the distance. I think everybody's heard of the High Line in New York City. The economic uplift that was responsible by that development from the surrounding buildings and the surrounding precincts was quite enormous. Not only the buildings themselves and therefore the opportunities that presented for the landlords and the building owners, but also for businesses in and around the High Line, whether it's cafes or coffee shops and restaurants, those sorts of issues. And there's lots of other examples all around the world as well. And here's one that really used to rock my socks when I was working in an infrastructure firm, and that is that you can think about how to actually introduce green or some sort of biodiversity even when thinking about tram lines. It doesn't actually always have to be about concrete, so that's Vauban and Freiburg. Another issue in relation to the biophilic city concept that I think helps us reframe all of the opportunities that exist in the debate is the conversations around urban farming. Not only and there's lots of great examples of urban farming throughout the world. I think Cuba is one of the best examples. When there was an embargo that existed between the US and Cuba, they decided to go and create their food source via urban farming. I think even today, something like 90% of all food is generated for Cuba within their urban farming landscape. So when we talk about our Australia as the food bowl, and you think about all of and people want to talk about deserts, well, let's just think about our cities as well. There are wonderful opportunities everywhere to think about all of that. And this was just some images that I dug up years ago in relation to some of the wacky and way out ideas that architecture firms have been able to come up with and how to integrate urban farms into the built environment. And there's obviously that was some years ago, so there are some of these opportunities these days that are starting to be realised, not just being talked about in research or academic terms. There are other significant infrastructure benefits associated with taking that biophilic city concept and expanding it. One is the improvement in water management, efficiency and recycling. And that's just one example around the world that they've replaced concrete culverts on the side of the roads with alternate edge treatments. There are other opportunities that are currently being rolled out all over the world where it comes to car parking that have abilities to, swales. There's a whole, and they're all happening right now. All of these issues are happening right now. Permeable concrete, permeable surfaces, not so much concrete, but surfaces, where you can also look to create growing areas as well as that water management exercise in this show. One of the things that is of particular interest and not talked about a whole lot in relation to these concepts is the potential for decrease in energy intensity, reduction in heat island effect, and therefore the consideration on climate change adaptation due to what's going to be an increase in temperature, already is an increase in temperature, and perhaps even further, almost definitely going to be further. The positive feedback loop is the one that probably interests me most in relation to this. We've got an existing building stock. Green building is an interesting conversation because you're talking about playing around at the edges. Unless you're actually dealing with existing buildings, you're really not making a difference. You can make a difference from the perspective of demonstration projects, but unless we actually get into our existing building stock, the differences are pretty minor. So with this particular one, if you think about increasing temperature that's going to occur, increasing heat island effect, what effect does that have on our buildings? What effect does that have on the comfort conditions for existing occupants of buildings? Therefore, what does that mean for the buildings themselves? Do they need to be upgraded? Does their air conditioning systems need to be greater? They therefore need to drag more energy into the buildings to be able to cool the people down more effectively. So you've got this positive feedback loop that Al Gore does talk about in relation to his climate change presentations. And we need to break that cycle. One of them is obviously through building upgrades, and I'm known for talking about that sort of stuff in another area. But there is some significant opportunity for thinking about how biophilia and how the effects of biophilia on the broader precincts, broader cityscape might actually assist in doing those sorts of, or making that sort of contribution. We already know that there are reports out there that talk about the billions of dollars in lost productivity associated with rising temperatures. In relation to things like cities and the effect on cities. Hopefully that doesn't flip to the next one. The effect on cities, there is another piece of research that I was aware of years ago from LA where they did what they call the Cool Roofs project. And they were able to save a couple of degrees across all of the roofs, and it was millions and millions of dollars in energy savings that were able to be achieved. We're also talking about deaths here, of course, with some of the rising temperatures, and we seem to see that on a regular basis as we hit these enormous heat waves, and the cost of that is obviously not something that you can count. I've showed this slide in lots of different presentations for lots of different reasons, and this particular one I'm thinking more about, well, what if we were to be able to reduce some of the car motorways that we have and use that for greening and greenscapes? So there is plenty of space, I guess, is the point that I'm trying to make with that. If I put my economic development hat back on, I also think about the development opportunities that exist if I'm freeing up all this additional land by going down the pathway of more and more public transport and thinking about how that works and getting rid of the roadways. So there are multiple benefits. There are only two that I've talked about. Years ago when I went to New Zealand, I found this particular park, the Petrol Engine Memorial Park. The main reason for showing this is that I think all Volvos should end up in this particular state. But it is an appropriate little artistic view of what's happening with the motor car. We keep talking about driverless cars these days and the benefits that may be attributed to those in relation to energy, in relation to usage, in relation to safety. There's a whole host of different benefits that can accrue from driverless cars. I hope that one of those two is a reduction in the amount of land that's required for car use. Improved health and wellbeing is a big component. I started off the presentation talking about the health of people within hospitals and their ability to be able to connect with nature, but it includes everybody, and it's both a physiological health, or it's therefore a physical health issue as well as a mental health issue. If you recall that other slide, this was a piece of research that was undertaken in Melbourne only a couple of years ago, where they talked about a 40-second green roof view was able to increase the sustained attention of staff, being able to undertake tasks. So an increase in productivity by being able to provide those sorts of real views to staff is an interesting proposition. If you then couple that with wellbeing programs in companies, which might include physical wellbeing, running up and down stairs, it might include healthy, nutritious food, it might include the ability to get together and walk around and walk through parklands and do those sorts of issues, have those sorts of things ingrained in what they're doing on a day-to-day basis. You can only imagine the improvements in wellbeing that might be attributable to that. Again, some years ago, when I was doing the work that I was doing at Curtin University, we did a paper around trying to come up with a productivity increase or improvement associated with just public transport use. And we were able to tap into some pieces of research around the world that talked about obesity, but it was really, really difficult to connect all the different pieces together, from the obesity piece to the physical wellbeing piece to the wellbeing, mental wellbeing piece to the piece that associated with nature and natural source systems. But we were still able to make a determination that around about a 6% productivity improvement was able if you were to promote active travel type requirements. And I guess my proposition has always been, if you sort of take just a small percentage of those and believe in it, and then maybe multiply it because of the things we don't know, back up again, we're talking about significant amounts of money. I have also written about some of the other opportunities that exist in relation to commercial office buildings and the productivity improvements within those spaces for staff members, and I came up with a number based on some pretty outrageous Sydney rents for A-grade office buildings, and correlated that to average salary costs of companies, and came up with the fact that if you got an 8% productivity improvement in your business because of the health and wellbeing of your staff, it would completely offset the $900 to $1,000 per square metre rental costs within your office building. So, that's a commercial office space issue, not necessarily one associated with the whole of a precinct issue, but I think you get the flavour of what I'm talking about. The more and more that we try and draw those dots to a return on investment, the more that we try and draw the line of sight to the economics of the health and wellbeing argument, I think the more and more likely we are to make some convincing arguments. And that, I think, is all I wanted to say. And I did that in 18 minutes. That's amazing.
All right.
Sweet.
Thank you.
Fantastic.